Using a 19mm socket, let's remove the lug nuts. Go ahead and remove the wheel and set it aside. So we went ahead and we put the key in the on position inside the vehicle. That's going to allow us to go ahead and turn our wheels like so. What we're going to start with here is we're going to come to our brake bleeder screw. We're going to pop off our rubber cap. Using a 10mm wrench, we're just going to go ahead and loosen this. And what we have here is a little bit of brake fluid dripping, and that's exactly what we want. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to use our ratchet. We're just going to snug this back down for now. We're going to come back to this. Using our 13mm socket and ratchet, we're going to go ahead and loosen these bolts on the caliper. Go ahead and spin these bolts out. And we're going to remove them both. At this point here, we have our two caliper bolts out. We're going to use a pry bar, and we want to go ahead and work our caliper off here. You want to be careful when you're loosening this that it doesn't just fall off. It'll add premature pressure or stretching pressure to our brake hose here. We don't want that. So just work that free. We're going to use our hanger. We're going to hook this on our strut spring just to hold this up and out of the way. Remove your pads from the shims here. Using a 15mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our caliper bracket bolts. I'm going to go ahead and spin these bolts out and remove both of them. Once that bolt is out, your caliper bracket will be free. Go ahead and set that aside. Now on our particular brake rotor, we have a T30 Torx screw holding the rotor to the wheel hub. If your vehicle doesn't have it, that's not a big deal. It just means that your rotors were probably removed at one time or another before. Now with age, our screw happens to be stripping out. Not a big deal. Simply we're just going to go ahead and drill this off, and we'll go ahead and remove the rotor. Go ahead and use our mallet. We'll go ahead and remove our brake rotor. Remove that and set it aside. The screw we just drilled out to remove our brake rotor is not a necessary critical component to our braking system. At this point here, we're just going to go ahead and grind this smooth with the face of the hub. So when we put our brake rotor back on, it won't interfere with the seating of that brake rotor. It'll be nice and smooth. Now what we're going to do is grab your caliper. I'm going to bring this down and over. And what we want to do is we're going to use our tool to compress the dual pistons back into the caliper. Before we do that, we're going to go ahead and loosen this to go ahead and let the brake fluid come out of the backside of this to make it easier to compress these pistons here. That's why we loosen this prior to disassembling everything. And we're just setting up our caliper tool, getting that into place. Let's go ahead and loosen this. Now I want to have some rags or a catch can underneath to catch this brake fluid. We have fluid coming out. Let's go ahead and compress this, and you'll see the fluid coming out. We're compressing our pistons in. Once those are compressed all the way in, go ahead and tighten up your bleeder screw. and snug that down. We'll release our tool, and we can see that our pistons are both completely pressed into our caliper, and our seals all look good here. So let's go ahead and hang this back up and out of the way. Using a 34mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our axle nut here. Now where a spindle or axle should be loose inside of our wheel hub, ours seems to be stuck a little bit. And just kind of give the end a couple taps. You can see that it is moving inside the hub, so we're good with that. Using a 21mm deep socket, we want to go ahead and remove our strut bolts to our knuckle. The upper bolt is spinning with this, so we're going to go ahead and put a wrench on this on the other side and go ahead and remove that nut. Using an 18mm deep socket, we're going to go ahead and loosen our tie rod and nut. Now that we have our tie rod nut off, let's go ahead and pop this off, set that aside. Let's remove our two strut bolts here. I'm going to tap these out. And if your bolts get stuck, you can simply use a punch. Go ahead and work those out. Going to use a pry bar just to work our knuckle free from the strut. Work this out, and at the same time, let's start pushing in on our CV axle. Get that free from the knuckle. Pull that forward and work our axle out of a knuckle. If we're still having a little bit of an issue, we could use a pry bar. Go ahead and work that knuckle down. Now on the back side of the CV axle where it goes into the transmission, I'm going to use a small pry bar. Reason for this, we just want to go ahead and pry and pop this out of the transmission. And go ahead and work that axle out like so. Now you want to go ahead and have a catch can underneath the vehicle or some towels. You can catch a little bit of transmission fluid seeping out at this point. Now you want to inspect your transmission seal. If the seal looks like it's damaged, you want to go ahead and replace it. Ours looks fine. Let's go ahead and line up our new CV axle. Get that worked onto the splines here. Now have that pushed into place. Let's go ahead and get our axle back into our wheel hub. And get our knuckle back up and lined up. Let's go ahead and install our strut bolts. We'll go ahead and line up our knuckle here. What we're going to do is we're going to put a screwdriver on the back side here. We want to go ahead and get this lined up with a knuckle and get our bolt started on the other side. Let's go ahead and get that upper one lined up. Get our bolt in. And we just work that into place. Let's go ahead and tap that bolt in. Let's go ahead and get our nuts installed. Now our CV axle still has to get seated on the inside here. So it has a little bit of play back here. It just has to go in a little bit more. On the axle, there is a groove or a notch right here. What we're going to do is we're simply going to put our pry bar into this. And we're going to hit the end of the pry bar and get the axle to pop into place. Let's go ahead and snug these bolts down. Line this up with the back side of your knuckle. You may have to go to the other wheel and turn that just a little bit to get that to line up. Get that lined up. You want to identify the hole in the outer tie rod end here for where your cotter pin is going to go. Put the washer on. Install the castle nut. We're going to go ahead and tighten this down to 22 foot-pounds. And you want to do 22 foot-pounds plus 120 degrees if you have the ability to do so. And once you're torqued, you want to go ahead and find that spot in your outer tie rod shaft here with that hole in it. That is that spot for your cotter pin here. If it doesn't line up, you do not want to back the nut off. You actually want to tighten it a little bit more to get that to line up. What we'll do is you can feed it through the back side. Grab your pliers. What we'll do is take this here, bend it over. And then we're going to cut off excess. Let's go ahead and install our axle nut. And we'll snug that down. I'm going to install 2 lug nuts. I want to go ahead and torque this down to 119 foot-pounds. All right, let's go ahead and remove the lug nuts. And we'll set those aside. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of anti-seize compound on our hub face here. I'm going to go ahead and install our rotor, but you want to make sure that the recessed screw hole lines up with the hole in your hub here. Again, set that on. Now at this point here, once you have your rotor on, if you still have your screw for this here, you can go ahead and install that. In our case here, we don't have that screw and it's not critical to the operation of our brakes. So at this point here, let's go ahead and press our rotor on, line up our caliper bracket, and we'll start putting our bolts in through the back side. Now we went ahead and cleaned our caliper bracket bolts and we're putting some thread locker on here. Let's go ahead and feed this through. And once you get that bolt started, we're going to go ahead and install the lower one. Once you get started a few threads, I like to go ahead and thread these in as far as you can by hand. And then we'll go ahead and snug those down. Let's go ahead and torque these bolts down to 133 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and take our brake pads. We're going to install our inboard pad. Install our outboard pad. Get those pressed into our sliders. Let's go ahead and pull our caliper off of our caliper bracket there, our hook, and we'll go ahead and slide our caliper into place. Push your slider pins in, get that lined up. Now I went ahead and cleaned up our slider pin bolts and put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. Get those bolts started. Let's go ahead and get these snugged down. Let's go ahead and torque down our caliper slide pin bolts to 26 foot-pounds. And once you have your caliper slide pin bolts torqued down, you want to hop into the vehicle, pump up the brakes, and get this caliper to compress down around the rotor with your new pads and rotors on here. Then you can go ahead and install your wheel and get that torqued. Go ahead and grab your wheel and get that installed. Let's go ahead and get the lug nuts all started by hand. Once you have your lug nuts on, let's go ahead and snug those down. Let's go ahead and torque our lug nuts down to 100 foot-pounds.